Every single morning, before most people over 60 even get out of bed, something is happening in their body that their doctor has never mentioned, not once. And by the time the consequences show up, and they will show up, the damage has already been building for years. I need you to stay with me through what I'm about to share, because what I've seen happen to patients who didn't know this is something I refuse to let happen to you. Here's what I'm talking about. Most mornings, within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking up, your blood sugar spikes. Even if you haven't eaten yet, even if you think you're eating healthy, even if your doctor says your numbers look fine. This morning insulin surge, researchers call it the dawn phenomenon, is a natural process. But in people over 60, particularly those with any degree of insulin resistance, it triggers something that goes far deeper than blood sugar. It triggers a cascade of damage to the most vulnerable tissue in your entire body, your peripheral nerves. And here's what makes this particularly serious. The damage is silent at first, completely silent. You don't feel it happening. The nerves don't send a pain signal when they're being starved. They just slowly stop working. And by the time you feel the burning, the tingling, the numbness, the weakness, by that point, the damage has been accumulating for years, sometimes a decade, and you had no idea. Now, I want to be clear about something right from the start. This is not your fault. Nobody told you this. Not your primary care doctor, not the specialist, not the cardiologist or the endocrinologist. In a standard 10-minute appointment, there simply isn't time to explain what I'm about to explain to you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't know it. You absolutely should, and that's exactly why I'm here. Let me describe something, and I want you to tell me, even if just to yourself, whether this sounds familiar. You wake up in the morning, and before your feet even hit the floor, they feel strange. Maybe a dull ache, maybe a tingling that runs through your toes. You stand up and there's a brief moment where you have to steady yourself, hand on the nightstand, waiting for your balance to settle. You've started doing that automatically. You don't even think about it anymore. By evening, especially after a long day or after a meal, the burning starts. Not a sharp pain, more like your feet are being held too close to a fire. You put your feet under the blanket and the weight of the sheets, just the weight of the fabric, is uncomfortable. You shift, you adjust. You lie there at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling because the sensation won't stop. And in the morning, you're exhausted. Not just from the bad sleep, exhausted from months, maybe years of this. You've mentioned it to your doctor, maybe more than once, and you heard some version of the same thing. It's common at your age. Or you got a prescription, gabapentin, maybe Lyrica, and for a little while, things felt slightly more manageable. But then the fog rolled in, the dizziness, the memory issues, the feeling that you were functioning at half your capacity. And the pain, it came back, sometimes worse, because those medications don't fix the underlying damage. They block the signal, they silence the alarm, but the fire is still burning. And deep down, you know something is wrong. Not wrong in a general way, wrong in a specific, progressive, getting worse every month kind of way, because you can feel it. The balance that used to be automatic now requires concentration. The stairs that you used to take without thinking now demand your full attention and one hand on the railing. The coordination that lets you button a shirt easily, hold a glass without gripping it too hard, pick up small things off the floor, that coordination is quietly slipping, and that terrifies you, not because of the inconvenience, because of what it means. You've seen what happens, you've heard the stories, a neighbor, a family member, someone who started with tingling in their feet and ended up in a wheelchair before anyone understood what was happening. And you lie awake wondering if that's where this is heading. Whether the body you've lived in for 6, 7, 8 decades is quietly betraying you. Whether you're going to become someone who needs help doing things you've done alone your entire life. I want to stop here for a moment and say something directly. That fear is valid. It is not an overreaction. It is not anxiety. It is your nervous system telling you, with the information it has available, that something needs to change. And I've watched too many patients ignore that signal, dismiss it, medicate it, push it aside, and pay a devastating price for it years later. I will not let that happen to you today. But here's what I also need to tell you, and I need you to really hear this. The progression is not inevitable. The damage is not locked in. What the research increasingly demonstrates, and I've seen this firsthand in decades of clinical practice, is that the peripheral nervous system has a remarkable capacity to begin recovering when the underlying cause is actually addressed rather than masked. But here's what I need to explain first, what that cause actually is. Think about the nerves in your body as electrical cables, thousands of miles of them, running from your brain and spinal cord out to your fingertips, your toes, the soles of your feet. Every one of those cables is wrapped in a protective coating, called myelin, the same way a copper wire is wrapped in rubber insulation. That coating is what allows the electrical signal to travel cleanly and accurately from one end to the other. When that coating is intact, the signal travels perfectly. You feel exactly what you're supposed to feel, exactly when you're supposed to feel it. Your balance works. Your reflexes work. Everything works the way it should. Now, what happens when that insulation starts to deteriorate? The electrical signal leaks, it distorts, it fires at the wrong time, or it doesn't fire at all. And what does that feel like from the inside? Tingling, burning, the sensation of electric shocks, numbness, areas that should feel temperature, that can't anymore, areas that should feel nothing, that hurt at the lightest touch. That's not a mystery. That's damaged insulation on the electrical cable. And here's where the morning insulin spike comes back into the picture, because this is what most people, most doctors, completely miss. When your blood sugar spikes first thing in the morning, even before breakfast, it triggers a process that directly damages those small blood vessels, the ones so tiny they're called capillaries, that feed oxygen and nutrients to your peripheral nerves. Those nerves, the ones running to your feet and hands, they don't have large blood vessels keeping them alive. They depend on a vast network of microscopic vessels. And when those vessels are repeatedly constricted, repeatedly deprived, repeatedly damaged by glucose, the nerve tissue downstream begins to starve, slowly, silently. And over years, that starvation becomes destruction. And here's what makes this even more serious, something I want to come back to in just a moment. This is happening in people who are not officially diabetic. People whose doctor looks at their fasting glucose and says, your numbers are fine. Because the damage threshold for peripheral nerves is lower than the diagnostic threshold for diabetes. You don't have to be diabetic for this process to be destroying your nerves. You just have to have consistent glucose spikes, and almost everyone over 60 does, particularly in the morning. Researchers at institutions studying metabolic syndrome and peripheral neuropathy have consistently found that nerve conduction velocity, the speed at which signals travel through peripheral nerves, begins declining well before blood sugar reaches diabetic range. The nerve damage starts in the pre-diabetic window, in the insulin-resistant window, in the window where your doctor says your numbers look acceptable. This is one of the most significant findings in peripheral nerve research in the last 15 years, and it has not meaningfully changed how most primary care physicians manage patients over 60. That gap between what the research shows and what patients are being told is exactly what I've dedicated my work to closing. Now, layered on top of the glucose damage is a second mechanism that accelerates the destruction. And this one is almost never discussed outside of specialized research settings. It's called oxidative stress. When your cells are repeatedly flooded with glucose, even moderate subclinical levels, they generate what researchers call reactive oxygen species. Think of them as sparks, tiny chemical sparks that damage cell membranes, mitochondria, and specifically nerve tissue. Your body has natural defenses against this, antioxidant systems that neutralize these sparks before they cause serious damage. But after decades, and particularly after 60, those defense systems are depleted, and the sparks accumulate faster than the system can extinguish them. The result is progressive nerve damage that compounds the glucose-driven capillary damage. Two separate mechanisms, both attacking the same tissue, both operating silently. And then there's the third layer. This one I want you to pay particular attention to, because it involves something millions of people over 60 are doing every day without knowing the consequences. Vitamin B12, methylcobalamin, the single most critical nutrient for myelin production and maintenance. The nutrient that your body uses to build and repair that protective insulation around your nerve cables. After the age of 60, the stomach's ability to absorb B12 declines dramatically because the cells that produce intrinsic factor, the protein B12 needs to be absorbed, become less efficient with age. This is a physiological reality, not a disease, but the consequences are severe. What makes this worse, and this is something I have to mention specifically for anyone who takes metformin, is that metformin actively blocks B12 absorption at the intestinal level. Not slightly, significantly. Studies show that up to 30% of long-term metformin users develop measurable B12 deficiency, and B12 deficiency means the myelin around your nerves cannot be properly maintained or repaired. The insulation thins, the signal leaks, and the burning, the tingling, the numbness, all of it intensifies. I had a patient, I'll call him Arthur, 71 years old, retired engineer from Ohio. He came to me after 4 years of worsening nerve pain in his feet and lower legs. He'd been on metformin for 11 years. He'd also been on gabapentin for 2 years, which was causing him significant cognitive fog. He told me he felt like he was thinking through wet cement. He'd tried 3 different B12 supplements from the pharmacy, none of which had made any difference. He was sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night. He'd stopped walking his dog. He'd stopped doing woodworking, something he'd done his entire adult life because he couldn't feel his fingers properly. He told me the worst part wasn't the pain. The worst part was watching himself become someone his wife had to worry about. When I reviewed what he'd actually been taking, the form of B12, the form of antioxidant support, the state of his other nutritional markers, the picture was almost textbook. Every piece of the underlying mechanism was present and unaddressed. We went to work on the actual root causes. 12 weeks later, he was sleeping through the night. The burning had significantly diminished. He was back walking the dog every morning. He sent me a photograph of a birdhouse he'd built. That photograph is still in my office. I want to be precise here. I am not telling you Arthur's story as a promise. I'm telling it as evidence of a mechanism, because what changed for Arthur wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was targeted nutritional support for a nervous system that had been depleted and damaged by 3 specific, identifiable, addressable processes. And that's what I want to spend the next few minutes explaining, because here's the thing about the nervous system that most people don't realize, and most doctors don't emphasize. Your peripheral nerves can regenerate, slowly, incrementally, under the right conditions. The peripheral nervous system has a capacity for repair that the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, does not. Peripheral nerves can regrow. They can remyelinate, but they can only do that when the conditions are right, when the nutritional substrate is available, when the oxidative burden is being neutralized, when the capillary damage is being countered. Without those conditions, the regenerative capacity sits dormant. With them, it activates. This is one of the most important things I can share with you today, and it's something I wish I could say personally to every patient I've ever watched suffer through years of symptoms that could have been addressed at the source. This isn't just about what you feel in your feet. I need you to understand the full scope of what's at stake when this goes unaddressed, because the consequences reach into every dimension of your life. The sleep deprivation alone, and anyone who has experienced nerve pain at night understands this completely, the sleep deprivation from chronic burning and tingling creates a cascade of secondary damage: cognitive decline, mood dysregulation, immune suppression, cardiovascular stress. You are not just losing sleep, you are losing the one restorative process your body depends on to do everything else, and when it's been stolen from you for months or years, the person you are during the day is a diminished version of yourself. That's not a metaphor. That is a measurable physiological reality. And then there's what happens to your relationship with your own body. When you can no longer trust your balance, when walking across the kitchen in the morning requires attention because you know you might grip the counter, something shifts psychologically. You start to shrink your world. You stop going places that involve unfamiliar floors, uneven pavement, steps without rails. You stop dancing. You stop the long walks. You stop the gardening. Not because you've decided to, because your nervous system no longer makes those activities feel safe. And with each thing you stop doing, you lose a piece of the person you are, the person who has walked through decades of your own life with confidence and capability. And the isolation that follows, because when you stop going out, when you stop doing the things that connected you to the people and places you love, isolation is the natural result. That isolation carries its own damage. Loneliness is not just an emotional state in older adults. Research is unambiguous on this. Social isolation accelerates cognitive decline. It worsens chronic pain perception. It increases mortality risk more than smoking. And it begins with something that seems as small as not trusting your feet to carry you where you want to go. I've put together a short presentation that goes much deeper into everything I've covered today. It includes specific approaches that I've seen work for patients in exactly this situation. The link is in the description below. Watch it when you have a quiet moment. I think it's going to answer a lot of questions you didn't even know you had. Now let me tell you what the research and clinical experience actually points toward, because Whereas there are specific nutritional compounds, specific forms of specific nutrients, that the evidence consistently links to peripheral nerve support. And I want to explain not just what they are, but how they work. Because understanding the mechanism is the difference between taking something and understanding why you're taking it. The first is methylcobalamin, not cyanocobalamin, the synthetic form used in most cheap supplements. Methylcobalamin, the active bioavailable form of B12 that crosses directly into nerve tissue in ways that the standard form simply cannot replicate. Researchers studying myelin synthesis have identified methylcobalamin as directly involved in the production and maintenance of the myelin sheath, the insulation around your nerve cables. When it's deficient, the insulation deteriorates. When it's adequately supplied in the right form, the conditions for remyelination improve. The distinction between the two forms is not marketing language. It is biochemistry. Most supplements on the market use cyanocobalamin because it is significantly cheaper to manufacture. Most people who have tried B12 and felt no difference have tried the wrong form. The second compound is alpha-lipoic acid. ALA. This is one of the most extensively researched natural antioxidants specifically studied in the context of nerve tissue. What makes alpha-lipoic acid unique, and this matters enormously, is that it is both fat-soluble and water-soluble. Most antioxidants are one or the other. Alpha-lipoic acid can operate inside the cell membrane and inside the cell's water-based interior simultaneously. It can also reach the mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside nerve cells, where most of the oxidative damage from glucose spikes accumulates. It neutralizes reactive oxygen species at the source. And critically, it regenerates other antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, glutathione, that have been depleted in the process of handling oxidative load. It is not an exaggeration to say that alpha-lipoic acid is one of the most specifically targeted natural compounds we have for addressing the mechanism of nerve damage I've described today. Third is benfotiamine, the fat-soluble form of vitamin B1. Standard thiamine, the water-soluble form found in most supplements, does not penetrate nerve tissue effectively. Benfotiamine does. It has been studied in European clinical settings for decades, specifically in the context of protecting nerves from glucose-related damage. The mechanism is precise. Benfotiamine activates an enzyme pathway that redirects glucose away from the chemical processes that produce the most nerve-damaging byproducts. It doesn't just provide a nutrient, it actively intervenes in the biochemical process by which elevated glucose destroys small blood vessels and peripheral nerve tissue. Fourth is acetyl L-carnitine. This is an amino acid compound that plays a specific role in energy production within nerve cells. Peripheral nerve regeneration, the actual process of regrowing and repairing damaged nerve fibers, is an extraordinarily energy-intensive process. Nerve cells need massive amounts of cellular fuel to accomplish it. Acetyl L-carnitine facilitates the transport of fatty acids into mitochondria, where they are converted into that fuel. Clinical research has studied it specifically in the context of nerve health support, and what emerges consistently is that it appears to support not just energy production, but the actual structural regeneration of peripheral nerve fibers. And fifth, magnesium. This one is underestimated almost universally. Magnesium is involved in over 300 enzymatic processes in the human body, and several of them are directly relevant to nerve function. Specifically, magnesium regulates calcium channels in nerve cell membranes. When magnesium is deficient, and the majority of people over 60 are chronically deficient, partly because dietary intake is insufficient, and partly because many medications deplete it, calcium floods nerve cells in unregulated bursts. The result is nerve hyperexcitability, which is exactly what burning, tingling, and hypersensitivity to touch feel like from the inside. Restoring adequate magnesium levels doesn't just support nerve function in a general way. It directly addresses a specific mechanism driving nerve pain. Now, you might be wondering, if all of this research exists, why hasn't your doctor mentioned any of it? That's a fair question. And the honest answer is not a conspiracy, it's a system problem. Medical education is structured around pharmaceutical intervention. It always has been. The research on nutritional support for peripheral nerve health exists. It is published in legitimate peer-reviewed journals, but it doesn't travel through the same channels as drug research. There are no pharmaceutical sales representatives bringing doctors lunch and leaving behind information on methylcobalamin. There are no large-scale marketing campaigns for alpha-lipoic acid. The information exists, but the infrastructure for moving it from research settings into clinical practice for patients who need it is almost entirely absent. And the result is that millions of people over 60 are suffering from something preventable, suffering in silence, accepting progression as inevitable, because the right information never reached them. That is not acceptable to me. It has never been acceptable to me, and it is the reason I continue doing this work. You are not powerless here. Your body still has the capacity to respond. The peripheral nervous system, unlike the brain, unlike the spinal cord, retains its regenerative potential. The morning insulin spike that's been setting off this cascade, there are specific evidence-based ways to blunt it. The B12 deficiency driving the myelin deterioration, addressable when you use the right form. The oxidative damage accumulating inside your nerve cells, neutralizable when you provide the specific compounds that reach that tissue. This is not speculation, this is mechanism, and when you address mechanism, you change outcomes. The next time you wake up in the morning and feel that familiar strangeness in your feet, that tingling, that burning, that moment where you have to remind yourself to be careful standing up, I want you to remember what I shared today, because now you understand what's actually driving that sensation. And more importantly, you understand that it doesn't have to keep progressing, that it is not simply the inevitable price of getting older, that the research points to something better, and that you deserve to know it. If today's video opened your eyes to something important, share it with someone you care about, because there are millions of people over 60 dealing with this silently, and they don't have to. The short presentation in the description goes even deeper. I highly recommend watching it when you have a quiet moment. Subscribe for more critical health information every week, and leave a comment below. What was the most surprising thing you learned today? I read every single one. If what I'm sharing today is new to you, and I suspect it is, make sure you subscribe to this channel. I release critical health information for people over 60 every week. Information your doctor may not have time to share in a routine appointment. Hit the subscribe button below. It costs nothing, and it could be one of the most important health decisions you make today.